Imagine stepping into a palace so grand it makes fairy tales look drab, only to come face to face with a king so physically malformed that even his own courtiers whispered he was cursed. This isn't legend or dark fantasy. This is the real story of Charles II of Spain, perhaps the most tragic monarch history ever produced. Known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, he became a living symbol of Europe's most powerful dynasty eating itself alive, victimized not by demons, but by a family obsession with bloodlines that made horror stories seem sane. Stick with me, because what you're about to hear is the kind of history they wouldn't dare teach in school. Before we dive in, if you crave more stories that read like the original Game of Thrones, go ahead and subscribe, because there's much more lurking beneath the velvet and gold of royal courts. Picture this. An ambassador travels thousands of miles to meet the King of Spain, the ruler of a global empire, and instead, he's greeted by a man whose mouth hangs permanently open, unable to close. That was Charles II. His jaw jutted so far forward, his lips barely touched. He drooled constantly, struggled to speak, and couldn't chew his food. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a grotesque calling card of inbreeding. The Habsburgs weren't interested in love. They chased power by keeping marriage in the family. Cousins, uncles, nieces, they all mixed in a family tree so tangled, you'd need a mathematician to untwist it. If you trace Charles's family lines, you find the same ancestors over and over. Like the genetic equivalent of getting stuck in a loop. Doctors now call it mandibular prognathism, but history just calls it a disaster. At dinner time, Charles couldn't manage solid food, so the royal kitchens mashed everything into a bland mush. Picture a king wiping soup from his chin, while courtiers pretend not to notice. Even speaking was agony. His words slurred into a mix that even native Spaniards struggled to decipher, requiring translation not from one language to another, but from Charles to human. There's a grotesque irony here. While most people dined to display power and wealth, Charles's dinners were a public struggle, a spectacle as tragic as it was humiliating. His mother, Queen Mariana, once wrote of her terror that he'd choke on his tongue in the night. And the truth is, every generation of selective marriage had produced more and more suffering, but the Habsburgs refused to stop. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when the pursuit of power trumps all other concerns. But Charles's jaw was only the start. His whole body seemed to defy nature. At 35, he looked less like a king and more like a ghost child. Short, hunched, with a head too large for his fragile limbs. It took him 8 years just to learn to walk, and even then it was a daily battle, lurching from wall to wall, as if the palace itself was the only thing keeping him upright. Even his mind was affected. Charles retained the emotional volatility of a toddler, fits of rage, hours of silence, and an inability to grasp even basic lessons. Tutors described the experience as pouring water into a broken jug. Knowledge went in, but nothing stayed. His hair was patchy. His body grew weaker year after year, and palace doctors could only marvel and despair at the spectacle of a king growing worse, not better, with age. And nobody could explain it. Was it a curse? A punishment from God? Not even the best minds of the time could answer. In reality, Charles was living proof of what centuries of closed genetic doors could do to a person. A tragic experiment in human frailty. Now here's where the personal tragedy spills out onto a continent-wide stage. The king wasn't just sick. He was the key to centuries of power struggles. Charles's main duty? Produce an heir. Yet no matter how many times he married, or how much the court tried to force the issue, it was impossible. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived in Spain hoping for fairy tale grandeur. Instead, her wedding night ended in tears. Charles simply wasn't physically capable of consummating the marriage. But nobody dared blame the king. The court tormented Marie-Louise with treatments, blamed her for barrenness, and subjected her to indignity after indignity. She spent her last years isolated and depressed, dying young under mysterious circumstances. His second wife, Maria Anna, faced the same fate, hopes shattered by palace reality. Letters she wrote after her marriage reveal a woman both terrified and resigned, aware her husband would never father a child. Physicians, alchemists, and exorcists tried every trick, but there was no escaping the Habsburg curse. Charles simply wasn't capable of producing an heir, biologically or otherwise. Behind closed doors, Europe began to tremble. Everyone knew Charles's death would leave a vacuum, a power struggle so inevitable that even before he died, armies were preparing for war. How's that for the most tragic irony? Generations of carefully concentrated power, undone by a single childless king. By now, the Spanish court had tried everything. Doctors, potions, even folk remedies from distant lands. When all else failed, they turned to what else? Exorcism. And these weren't private affairs. Imagine a royal throne room full of dignitaries, nobility, and priests, all bearing witness as the king is splashed with holy water, forced to swallow remedies made from ground-up relics, and pressed beneath crucifixes until he screamed. Father Froilan Diaz, the royal exorcist, became convinced Charles harbored no less than 47 demons, each responsible for a different torment. The king screamed, vomited, and sometimes slipped into unconsciousness for days, while the court watched helplessly. Even the palace itself was purified. Priests collected gifts, clothes, and even chairs, burning anything believed to harbor dark forces. For Charles, who was desperately suggestible and aware of his own failing body, the exorcisms may have provided psychological comfort. But the spectacle, in retrospect, reads like an act of collective royal desperation, an empire reduced to superstition in the face of overwhelming evidence. In 1700, Charles finally succumbed. When his doctors opened him up for an autopsy, they uncovered something out of a nightmare. His heart shrunken and blackened, his lungs decayed and filled with rotting matter, his intestines essentially decomposing, and his reproductive organs so underdeveloped that it's a wonder he lived to adulthood at all. Most shocking of all, an excess of fluid surrounding his diseased brain, showing the toll centuries of inbreeding had taken. The royal physician's report was so grotesque it was initially kept secret. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ. For a long time, these findings only fueled rumors of sorcery, rather than ending them. How else, people wondered, Could a king survive like this without dark forces at play? But we know now Charles wasn't cursed by witches. He was doomed by biology, by a family tradition that put bloodline above all else. The aftermath? With no heir, Europe descended into the War of the Spanish Succession, a decade-long bloodbath that changed the map of Europe forever. Charles II's life was a living warning. Sometimes the drive for power destroys the very thing it sets out to protect. He stands as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the cost of ignoring science and compassion in the name of royal certainty. If this dive into the bizarre and shocking world of royal history blew your mind, be sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories that history books won't tell you, and hit the comments. What infamous dynasties or royal mysteries should we uncover next? Let's keep the conversation and the curiosity alive.